Mike Fileti, super pumped to have you on this episode of the Ops Drop today. For all of our audience members who aren't acquainted with Mike, he is the head of IT service delivery at Advisory Solutions. Mike, I'm super excited to have you on today because I witnessed so much of your genius working together at Electric, particularly from a business systems and tooling and overall operations perspective. One of the things that you've said that really stuck in my mind was really that the key to business longevity is setting up a really healthy foundation. So if you could tell us a little bit more of what that means to you and where that perspective comes from, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you, Mackenzie and Darren, for having me. Yeah, I think the key to building a healthy foundation in business is just understanding that it's really about the long game when you're building out your business system, because anything that you build out now will likely stick around a lot longer than you think. So everything you build will build on top of the current systems that you have. So if you don't start out with a proper foundation and laying that really well done groundwork, you're just going to start building up a lot of technical debt, and it's going to become a lot more expensive later on to replace or upgrade systems later. And I really think that there's a lot of design thinking when starting up and scaling a business that you really have to put that work in place first.
Michael, you get your stakeholders who want you to do things quickly. And there's this fine tune between getting things done quickly to meet a quick result and then being able to do what's needed to be done for longevity and building the foundation out. How do you balance the two of those?
It's a great question. I find that I am the type of person that will always try to slow the process down and I think I'm a healthy balance for the people who want to speed the system up. So I will try to go to my stakeholders and tell them, hey, if we do this wrong, it's going to have a lot of long-term potential impacts. And let's just consider a bunch of different options before rushing into this because, like I said before, whatever you put in place now is going to stick around a lot longer than you think. It could be years before you reevaluate a bad decision that you made.
What are the keys of setting up a healthy foundation?
Oof, yes. So to me, a healthy foundation in my mind starts with choosing the right tools. I think the right tools, everything in a business nowadays is built upon the tools that your business is using. Whether those are SaaS platforms, you really have to understand that the decision-making process should not be done haphazardly. Like, I think it should be really tightly controlled. Uh, there should be an evaluation criteria. There should be centralized oversight inside of your business to decide which tools you should or should not use. But everything should be in the service of increasing the repeatability of the desired outcomes that you're looking for. Ultimately, the less tools your business needs to use, the better, tightly controlled things are going to be in the long run. So, optimizing for which tools you use, but also trying to use less of them.
Yeah, 100%. I think Mike and I have experienced that very much ourselves, right? And that like tool sprawl is not something that you just see within tech companies. It's many companies as the needs sort of arise over time, right? Like departments start acting in a siloed way sort of naturally and buying their own things and operating in different ways. So it's really hard to um get ahead of that and, you know, make sure you're picking the right things at the right time. Obviously, there's always room for improvement and change, but Mike, I agree with you. Just being as thoughtful as you can in setting up your tech stack is super important. So that being said, you know, getting even more tangible, like what does a good foundation look like? And what does a bad foundation look like? And if you could, you know, provide any sort of good examples of those, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. To me, a good foundation as opposed to a bad one. A good foundation is designed with intention. Um,
Mm,
as you can imagine, a lot of businesses start out, and a lot of the processes that are built and the systems that are used kind of they kind of happen organically, and without much thought. And a lot of that knowledge gets passed down from one employee to the next. And those systems and processes aren't really well documented. And then over time, more and more people come in. There's just not a lot of centralized documentation about how things are done. So I think a really well-built business has their tools and their processes documented, because just the act of documenting something means you're observing it, and then you're able to kind of go forward and pick apart the pieces that should be added, removed, deleted from the process. So, and then that just increases the consistency and the repeatability of what you do every day. I would say a bad foundation kind of has a lack of centralized oversight. So, like you mentioned before, I think if different teams are allowed to choose their own different tools without an idea of how those all work together and integrate, you're going to have a lot of siloed stuff in the business, and people are not going to be able to work well together. And that's like the key to everything in business is like how well information can flow throughout the system, how you can get work done, how the processes go from one thing to the next. I think that's really important. So avoiding that tool bloat, like you were saying before, makes it really hard to scale.
Let's say, you have a leader who comes into an organization freshly, and they obviously you walk into adopting whatever issues a company has when you come in fresh. What's some ways to identify what is a bad foundation and what is a
Hmm.
good foundation, and what you should retain and what you should get rid of?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think when I when I came into the business that I'm in now, it's been about a year. The first thing I did was, instead of asking people like, "Hey, how can things be improved?" The best thing you can do is just sit, watch, and observe what they do. It's even
mm.
better to sit next to them. But if you're not physically able to sit next to them, observing their process, have them talk it through end to end, and really understand what they do. And then if you have to document it out, it allows you to put that sort of thing on paper. I know it's very painful to have to do, but most people are avoiding it because it's painful. So I think just the act of going in and observing allows you to really put down to paper what you actually do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
I think that is so important, not only for operators to do, but leaders as soon as they come in. Like, just go and observe your team, go sit and watch how they work. I think research and asking questions and sending your team surveys is effective, but it pales in comparison to just sitting and watching your team work and how they operate and seeing, you know, how they swivel seat between systems, how they have to communicate with other teams, how long things take to get, and you can more easily see the impact of that, not only within the team, but on the customers, right? So that being said, um, it's observation is key, but in terms of like some guidance you can give to a startup on really where to start when prioritizing creating an operational foundation and supporting processes, um is something I would love to hear a little bit more about. Like, where's the you know if I'm a person and I'm like you and I'm walking into a new business and I'm like, this is there's a lot going on, there's a lot of chaos, a lot of things to be fixed. Like, what's a good place to start?
Yeah, a good place to start. And I think I want to take this from like right from the beginning of a business. Like, what is the a leader's
Yeah.
perspective? I think it's to start out and trying to identify that if you are like the owner or leader of a business and you don't feel that you are very operationally minded,
Mhm.
where you may not be able to build those processes. Maybe you just want to move quick and, maybe you're more in sales and you are good at acquiring customers. It's good for you to balance that out with finding another operational leader to
Yep.
work with to help to architect and build out some of your systems. So right from the get-go, if I tend to see businesses not prioritize operations until it's far too late. And at
Yep.
that point, they kind of haven't built out the right foundations. So they'll get stuck at some point in their growth where, things get a little dicey. It's because they haven't kind of set up the right foundations as we talked about. And I think when you want to start out as an operations professional in a business and you're like looking around, one thing in addition to observing people is, when you first start out is go on a listening tour. Mackenzie, I learned a lot from you about that, is really going to different departments and understanding what it is they do and how it all fits into the big picture.
Right.
If you can really understand that, you can start really understanding where the synergies between the different departments come from and how they work together, on a day-to-day basis.
When operations, one of the things that I find really difficult is every time you want to do something, there becomes this little piece of having to sell it to the business, right?
Mhm.
You bring on a new foundational system, you bring on a new process, everything needs to be sold. In order for you to sell doing something for foundational reasons rather than an immediate result of a request that somebody sent over, what do you find is the most successful way for you to be able to articulate what you're wanting to do and sell it upstream to make sure you get everyone to buy in on it?
Yeah, I've done this many times, and it never gets easier because it's very easy to look at this thing that I do now and implement, or this tool will get me these results within a certain amount of time, and that's tangible, and that's really easy to measure. But I often find that the most important things that you need to do from a foundations perspective in a business are not easily measurable. And that becomes really hard to sell to business leaders because they are continuously looking at, well, what is that metric? What is that growth? How can I achieve that outcome? Because then I can go back to the business and say, look at what I've accomplished. So
Mhm.
I think that there needs to be a layer above the individual departments making their goals. Someone has to be a general oversight, like, is this a good idea for the business itself?
Yeah.
How does this tool, process, system, whatever you build, work with the other departments to to scale up? Does it work in the long run? Because selling to the business is one thing. The other is convincing them that what you're looking at, you may not know whether it's a good decision or not, unfortunately. But as long as you're asking the right questions and making people really think about it, I think that's where I come from is really important.
So when you're thinking about doing that foundational work and you're streamlining and simplifying your internal operating processes and systems, how does that improvement internally translate to an external customer experience?
Hmm. So that's great. To me, I'm in a service business, IT support, and to me, everything is about the customer experience. So I have to design systems and processes around that. And a lot of times I think about and this translates to any business too, even if you're not a service business, is all of your internal stakeholders are your customers, right? So I personally like to think about every single internal team as a customer of mine and how I can build a foundation for them. How can I build a process for them? How can I make their lives easier? That in effect will translate right back to actually serving your actual paying customers. So if you can fix processes internally for your internal customers, it's going to translate externally to your customers as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's like, that is one of the biggest issues facing, I want to say tech right now, but it goes way beyond industry boundaries for sure, right? Because most businesses right now have adjusted to working remotely, or they're, offshoring their talent. And the siloing of humans, the disconnection that they have in communications, in their systems, and so on and so forth, we can easily see, sort of coming out in the wash, right? Even as customers ourselves of different tools and technology or services and so on and so forth, right? Like, you can tell if you are you're working with a customer success team or a support team that works closely or does not, right? Like, if I'm reaching out and it feels like every time I'm talking to somebody new and they don't have an understanding of me or my business, I'm like, oh, okay, these people are probably not operating in an optimized way.
Right.
um, and I think one thing that's really important when you're developing processes, right? And as you mentioned, Mike, like, internal improvements are most important and they will wash out into the customer experience, is like making sure those processes and tools are really usable and accessible, right? Um, so can you talk to us a bit about usability and accessibility as you're building out new systems and processes? How do you think about this?
Sure. Yeah. For me, usability is just about making it simple for the customer. That
Mhm.
can be your internal stakeholders, teams, or your actual customers. To me, I like to obsess over language, right? Written language. Because that to me is the thing that translates. If you make it simple for anyone to understand and read, so I will constantly edit things. Like, instead of just shipping something I wrote out the door, I'm a continuous editor. I always try to look at it from the outside perspective. Whoever is reading it, I want to understand, are they going to get it? Um, so I think language is really important.
Mhm.
Another customer experience thing is self-service, right? Whether that's internal documentation, a knowledge base for external documentation for the customer to read, all of that written, again, it goes back to language, is important for translating expectations, customer experience, the usability of your product or service.
Right.
Um, and that comes down to, like, the more you have documented, technically, if you documented it, it means you've standardized it. You've created some sort of predictable process that has some repeatability, right?
Mhm.
Which means your customers know what to expect of you. And that expectation builds consistency, and that consistency builds trust and loyalty over time. So I can't overstate enough how important, like, building the standardization, the consistency, the knowledge, is important to that customer experience.
In operations, Michael, you're going to get a senior leader who comes to you and says, "Hey, I need you to instill some process and I need you to standardize some of this stuff." And that's a big part of operations. But on the opposite end of that coin, you also have that same leader saying, "I need somebody who can operate in the gray." And they need to be able to be a little bit more nimble and like understand when things shouldn't necessarily be followed. How do you draw the line on what should be a held fast process or policy that you're holding to, and then where you have some of that ambiguity and you operate in the gray a little bit?
Right. Um, yeah. I mean, as much as I talk about process and I do realize that, sometimes I can tend to over process things, and not everything needs a real process. So understanding when something should have a process that you follow to a T, or where there's some gray area, I think all comes down to, like, the ambiguity of what the what the task is, right? If it's something that can be done the same way and should be done the same way every time, then you can create a checklist for it and you could say follow it to a T. However, if there's ambiguity, there needs to be flexibility. So instead of building a process, you can build a framework or a methodology, right? So if I were to translate this to something I do in IT, I would compare this to something that you need to follow a process every time is how to set up a new laptop for a new employee, right? You really don't have to have much change in that. However, if someone comes to you with says I need troubleshooting help, my computer is not working, I don't know why. Well, you can't give them an exact process. You kind of have to rely on the technician's ability, uh, their experience, what they've learned over time to get to the right answer. However, if you give them this methodology of troubleshooting, which is, what questions to ask, how long has this issue been going on for? When did it start? How many other people might be affected? Um, you can start getting these like standardized questions that, will help you get to the right answer faster, but there's still not an exact process. So you operate within this framework, and you give people that. And I think that is where that ambiguity helps not follow the process to a T.
Right. It's like certain things, especially if there are certain things that need centralized process. Here's a checklist. Here's how we do things. And then there's guidance and you can get creative, right? Like, please think outside the box if you're troubleshooting something, or, problem solving doesn't have to be done in an extremely specific way. That makes sense. And I think, one thing that I've run into a lot is like, particularly C-suite leaders or senior leaders, the way they think about operations is like, it doesn't matter how we do it as long as it gets done. And I think that's sort of an old school way of thinking, or it's becoming a bit antiquated, right? Where now during this time of like everybody cares about profitable, efficient growth, operations does matter. How we do it does matter. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective, Mike, on this standpoint.
Yeah, my personal philosophy is that how you do what you do is the company's secret weapon. It's the company's secret sauce. Just because you can do something and get a result doesn't actually mean you could get that result consistently over time, right? So if you have a superstar employee who, they can meet that sales goal, they can somehow pull it off, but there's no consistent way of getting to that. Or if you can focus your team really on one objective and they can hit it for that quarter, it does not mean that they can hit it quarter over quarter over quarter. So I find that the how you do things is the secret sauce to how your business works. Because you need to put in that process in place to deliver the consistent result. Um, I think getting the results isn't necessarily enough because it's about getting the consistent results. And frankly, great people don't scale, right? But great people can create processes that scale. And I
Yeah,
think that's a really important thing that needs to be focused on.
yeah. I think, Mike, when you first started answering the question, I think uh you brought up something interesting, which is like the way people, it's not just the way people go through the process and operate, it's also their behavior as well, right? And like, it does matter how you do it, and it does matter how you interact within the business, and how you work through things, right? So that's one interesting point. And the second is like, it essentially, how do you know if things are going well if everybody's doing something really different and the data is completely, how is the data reliable if it's operating on a process that is not consistent, or the way that they're operating isn't consistent, right? And this is something that I think actually go-to-market teams do really well. And Darren, I'd love to hear your perspective, is like, most go-to-market teams are not operating on 10 different sales methodologies, right? They're sort of sticking to one and ingraining that and training that and doing a lot of enablement there. And therefore it's much easier to look at that data, see if you're growing or not growing, see, along the sales pipeline, like, are you getting more qualified leads, less qualified, generating more opportunities or less? And because everybody's sort of using the same methodology and is enabled on the same thing, you can make easier tweaks because you know where things are falling out in the funnel. And that attests to exactly what you're saying, like how it works and everybody operating in a at least similar way is the most important thing.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mackenzie. I think when you think about go-to-market plan, it's like kind of like baking a cake, right? There are steps that happen in succession, and that's how you know that you're on the right track because you're doing one step after the other and it follows, like the lead to opportunity to sales. Everyone follows that same pathway because it's the psychological effect of like the process of buying something. People need to be informed, they need to be aware, they need to like understand what's going into their decision making. They need to take the time to understand what they're buying, and that is based off psychology, right? And that the sales methodology is based off psychology. When you think about operations, however, it's different, right? I guess in some scenarios it could be somewhat similar, but I'm curious, Michael, on your thought when you're looking at go-to-market perspective. You have those early stage indicators because we understand the psychology of a sales process. The customer comes in, they want to do some research, they do a little bit of understanding, then they determine if it's a good purchase for them, and then they make the decision to buy, right? With operations, how do you know that your operations need to be overhauled or that they're heading in the right direction or they're servicing those needs? Because it's not as black and white as like the psychology of like buying something.
Yeah. Yeah. I think sales organizations, like, there's a methodology and a playbook, and like there's very clear results, like it's very easy to measure, whereas operations, sometimes it's harder to measure, slight gains in efficiency or how employees feel about, the processes of the company. Like that's not easy to measure. But I think if the operation, how do you know if operations are not meeting the needs of your current company? I think there's some really good warning signs and or indicators. So as your company grows, if people are asking too many questions internally, like who do I go to for this, or how does this work, or what do I tell the customer here? It there's a clear indicator there that like you haven't figured something out in your operations. Another thing we were talking about, Mackenzie, is like with tool bloat, if you have too many scattered systems, that means your data is everywhere. You have no central source of truth for specific data points. You actually can't gather the data to make better decisions. So having too much data everywhere, scattered systems is, you need to start figuring out how to consolidate tooling and or consolidate your data on the back end. Um, but Darren, to the point is what I was saying before is the results, right? If you're getting inconsistent results quarter over quarter, whether that's in customer service, whether that, you're measuring CSAT scores or time to resolution or any of those sort of metrics, if it's inconsistent, that means you probably have some sort of operational issue in internally. And then the number one, I would think, and I've seen this before, is if your customers tell, say, your customer success managers that like the expectations of what they bought in sales is not what they are getting, that's a huge problem. That means there's something in your feedback loops that are not working from customer success to sales to fix those problems. And
Mhm.
that really is something that easily leads to clients churning, So to me, it's all about setting customer expectations properly. And like that can be done as simple as, putting together a knowledge base that internal and external customers can reference.
So, Mike, one of the biggest parts of a good implementation or, just having better operations at a company is building a continuous improvement mindset within your company, right? Because it's not just about implementing good process, it's about implementing good behavior as well. Um, so how do you usually help build that mindset in the companies that you work at?
Sure. And it's really for me, it's a little bit easier because I have a continuous improvement mindset that I've developed over many years. But when I want to instill that in the company, like through and through, and in the people that I manage. So uh, I think developing a continuous improvement mindset for in the company, first of all, it has to start at the top. It has to start at the leadership level. Like pretty much every leader in the business should really be focused on working on the business, not just in the business, right? How can they fix problems that are happening for their teams? How can they fix problems that are cross departments? How can they work with the other leaders on like continuously improving things? So really, leadership has to model it at the top. And then I often try to coach people in one-on-ones. I don't ask them, like, what do you think can be improved? But I ask questions more along the lines of like, hey, what is not working? And then maybe what would be some ideas on how we could potentially fix them? So like over time, if you start asking those questions consistently enough, I think people in their normal jobs kind of internalize that and put it in the back of their head and say like, well, like the next time something like this comes up, oh, I notice a problem. Well, like maybe how could I resolve that in a way that's like, oh, this is potentially a repeat consistent problem that I see more than once. Then they start to figure that out over time, how they can continuously improve things. And then I overall, I think if you're an operational leader and you do change management well, like really, over communicate, have people understand what's in it for them when you do changes internally. They start to build a muscle for change over time. And then they start, if you do it really well, they start to feel psychologically safe in changes. And then they start to embrace change over time because they realize that change is leading to something good and it's not, that continuous improvement mindset kind of sinks in when you do change management well.
I love what you said there, Michael, in reference to change management with operations. I think it's one of those subjects that's not talked about enough around operations is like an environment of consistent change. And so getting really good at change management really is a great indicator of like a really well-built operation infrastructure. When you're looking at building psychological safety around, consistent change and understanding what's in it for them, I love that you outlined what's in it for them because I think that's the quickest way to build trust around change. And you also mentioned over communication. Both, I completely agree with you. Both of those are huge proponents of like really successful change. What are some other tips that you could give to some operations leaders to help them make sure that any changes that they make in the future, they're doing so in a way that minimizes the negative impact of change?
For change management, I think some other tips in terms of how to do change management really well is there's a few really key elements that as an operational leader will need to nail. The first one is timing. So understanding that change to be successful really takes time. It needs to be planned out. You need to understand that there needs to be time to design a process, write training materials, communicate those upcoming changes both internally to your stakeholders and externally to your customers, train employees. All of this takes a lot of time. So to me, planning out a timeline ahead of time on a change and not rushing it is really key. The second thing is to me is documentation. I talk about it all the time, but more specifically in change management, I think the document that you want to write is a FAQ, right? A frequently asked questions. And the reason why that's so important is because you can actually anticipate the questions that are going to come up during the change, and you can answer them ahead of time before people even have the thought of asking them. And I think if you anticipate the questions that are going to be asked, that helps build that psychological safety because people start realizing, like, oh, you've thought of all of this, you've thought of all these potential issues ahead of time. Now I feel a little bit better knowing that this change is going to happen. So I think that's an FAQ document is really important. When you're over communicating, I think that helps break down the barrier of people resisting change. Even if they don't read the document, knowing it's there kind of makes them a little bit feel a little bit safer. And then the absolute requirement for me in change management is you really have to like burn the ships. And what I mean by that is like if you have an old system and you have an old process, whatever you put in place now, you need to literally dismantle what you had before. People cannot be able to go back and use the old system. You either need to nuke it or you need to make it read only so they can't make changes in it. But whatever that migration is, you kind of have to dismantle the old system and kind of force adoption on the new one. And when I say force adoption, I mean do it in a humane way, right? Like give people enough time to learn ahead of time before you like force them over, but you do have to force them because ultimately a change will not work if you allow people to go back to the old way of doing things.
I love that. Burn the ships. I'm gonna remember that. I'm gonna take that one with me as well. I like that. I like that saying. I want to thank you for coming and talking to Mackenzie and I. But before I let you loose, one last question for you. Do you have any advice to any other operations leaders out there or in regards to what we talked about today that you'd like to share with them?
Yeah. I think I will leave it at being intentional, right? And in building your processes, building your systems. Like I said from the beginning, if processes and things just come about organically and kind of develop unintentionally, you didn't do enough design thinking, right? You didn't understand how systems work together, how tools integrate with each other, how data is centralized. Like you really can't scale without having a really good understanding of that from the get-go. And to me, that is if you haven't prioritized that in your current business, wherever you are, the best time to start is always now. Um, so get started, get thinking about it, bring it to your leadership teams and start talking about like what does this look like on a macro level, on a whole? Like where are the big problems, and how can we tackle them?
Mike, thank you so much for coming. Great wisdom, and we appreciate you. Hope you have a
Yeah.
great rest of the day.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.